Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Light Gate. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 FM from the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM from beautiful New Orleans. The Light Gate is fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Carnation. So thank you, Carnation, for being the newest part of our journey. Hey, Preston.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much. Thank
Oh,
you, everyone.
happy to
Episode
be here.
86.
Wow, 86. God.
Yeah.
Almost, I feel like I should be saying I feel old, but it's
We're not 86 yet. The show is.
yeah. What is that in dog years?
So yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for stepping in for Dolly Saffron. You guys may have noticed she's missing tonight. She is in chat, so she will be joining us through chat. But Michelle is going to be our lovely co-host tonight. So thank you so much, Michelle, for stepping in.
Pleasure. Thank you. I've been looking forward to it because unlike many people, I'm just kind of dipping my toes into some of this over the last few years. And this is very new topic for me, this case. So I'm going to be his student tonight with you and Frank, and I'm just going to enjoy every moment of this.
Cool. All right, guys. Thank you. Episode 86 of The Light Gate. I'm your host, Preston Dennett. Our co-host tonight is Michelle Desrochers. You can actually find her on The Outer Realm every Wednesday and Thursday night, along with Emilia Fasano. Check that out, 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Lovely show. I've had the wonderful honor to be on it a couple of times at least.
You're a frequent flyer, Preston.
And yeah, our guest tonight, you guys, is amazing. He's got a couple of really awesome books out that you really, if you want to know the truth about UFOs, you have to read these books. The Braxton County Monster and Shoot Them Down. We'll get into that in just a second. But I do want to say hello to all you lovely people. It's because of you we do this show. We have so much fun every Monday. And I see quite a crowd in there already. I am so excited. Who do we have? We have Renee Cruz. Hello, Renee. Here, let me pull down this banner just for a second. I'll bring it back up later. And a lot of people. Yay, I'm so excited. All these people. I recognize you guys. Teresa Levine. Hi, Dolly, Preston, Frank, and Michelle tonight. We have Mary Lair. We have Dawn Curtis. Hi, Dawn. Scuba Maru, can always count on you. Kaj, how you doing? All the way from Brazil? Wow, that's amazing. Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, Night's Glories, wishing Dolly a speedy recovery. Yes, she had some surgery there and it went excellent. We have Becky Sloan. We have Namaste with her endless generosity. Thank you, Namaste. I just can't express how much you make me smile every week when we do this show. And I see you pop up. You're just absolutely wonderful. Love you so much. I know Dolly does too. She's sending big hugs. Okay, we have, who else? Dolly is in chat. We have the Owl Man. Very cool. Thank you, the Owl Man. You guys, these donations really help us to fund the show. So thank you so much. It means more than I can ever express. Thank you so much, the Owl Man. And who else we have? We have Ruth Kleiber. And I know I'm pronouncing that right because I asked. We have Catmaster Trash, psyched about the show. Oh, makes me very nostalgic. Very cool. We have Louise, all the way from New Jersey.
A lot of action in New Jersey these days.
Drones. Yeah. Well, we're going to be doing a Q&A next week, guys, so I'm sure we'll dive into that topic. I know what Dolly has to say about it. Covert military activity, and I'm on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
We can definitely dive into that.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Houston, thanks for joining us. Fab. Glad you could make it. And Helena Nyborg. Thank you. And Cliff Olinger. Oh, my goodness. I'm going to get in trouble shortly. I've got 1 more minute before I get my wrist slapped for taking too long to bring in the guest. Frank should be interesting. Yes. I have been trying to get him on the show, and he finally agreed. Thank you, Frank. So grateful. Mike, bringing the popcorn, wishing Dolly good wishes. And who else? Z Sun Dragon says hi,
Crazy
Preston,
son.
and hi, Dolly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have Nicole, aka Coley. Hope you're doing well. We love you. Janie Mashburn. And definitely got to go through these fast or I will get in trouble. Hi, John. We have Royston Marshall Love from London. Very cool. Don't try to get me to do an English accent because I'll just embarrass myself. I love an English accent. Catherine Four Feathers, CT Guitar Guy. Yay. Herbie Flurby. Don't you just love these names people come up with?
They're great handles. They really are.
Joseph A. Dolly is here in spirit. Yes, she is. We have Royston Marshall. We have Truth Seeker Light. Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you. Happy face.
Hello.
Keith Witherell. No drones here. Just a matter of time, Keith. Matter of time. Mm-hmm. Brian W. Hello. We got Bridget. We have KCF. We have Olivia. We have me getting in trouble. We have Lisa.
I'm going to see someone winging across the room.
I love saying hi to you guys. It's fun.
They do a whole show on it.
Hira, we have Barris all the way from. We got a nice audience in Australia. Oh, Michael's
Australia's great.
Yeah. Question already. I starred your question, Michael. Okay. Yeah. If you guys have any questions, please do pop them in. Caps does help. But I'm just going to get started, you guys. I really see quite a few of you other people in here. Oh, Almir, all the way from Brazil. But our guest is so amazing that I really just want to dive right into it. So before I do actually bring him on, let me tell you a little bit about our guest, Frank C. Feschino Jr. I've got his book, The Braxton County Monster. It's rare that I read a book that was literally a page turner from beginning to end about what I thought was going to be one incident, but turned out to be quite a bit more than that. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Frank is a graduate of the Paier College of Art in Hamden, Connecticut. He's an accomplished artist. He studied illustration, commercial art, and photography, and was trained by several world-famous artists. In fact, earned his 4-year diploma in fine arts in 1981, then moved to Florida, where he studied film and video production at Phillips Jr. College in Daytona Beach. He was actually trained by Hollywood camera operator Rich Davis. Graduated with an associate's degree in film and video production and a minor in business. Okay, now we get to the subject of today's show. While visiting family in Braxton County in the early 1990s, Frank became aware of the Flatwoods monster UFO crash incident in Braxton County. This was on September 12, 1952, and he began to investigate it. This case involves a UFO and its apparent ET occupant, a 12-foot, get that 12-foot, Michelle, it's twice our height.
Wow.
12-foot tall, armor-clad being that crash landed on a farm in Flatwoods and encountered a curious group of local townspeople. I bet they were curious. So subsequently, he began an in-depth investigation into this case, which lasted decades. And he uncovered a massive UFO cover-up, which was implemented by our own sweet United States government with your tax dollars. Let's not forget that. So after decades researching this case, he wrote the groundbreaking book that chronicles his investigation into the famous Flatwoods monster incident. It's titled The Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. Make sure you get the updated and revised edition. I put this in a link in the show notes. You can get it from Lulu. That's the best place to give the author the rewards for doing his research. Such an important case. I cannot wait to get into this. Frank, of course, has appeared on many West Virginia television talk shows, TV news broadcasts, and radio programs. And, of course, nationwide. Was featured in the first ever Flatwoods Monster cover story and in an article in UFO magazine. Let's see. He's on Monster Quest and the History Channel. Featured the Flatwoods Monster and the Frametown Monster incidents of 1952. And additionally, Frank Feschino has produced a documentary that he wrote, shot, and narrated, which focuses on his amazing investigation into the Flatwoods Monster case. And this appears on YouTube. So after spending decades in search of the truth, a lot of time, money, and effort, Frank has become the go-to guy, the genuine authority on the Flatwoods Monster incident and the UFO events of September 12, 1952. And if you look up that date, you're going to be amazed. He's also the author of the highly acclaimed book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952. Made me laugh when we heard the congressional hearings and the heads of the Defense Department were asked, have we ever shot at them? Both quickly said no. I almost threw a shoe at the screen because this book proves beyond any reasonable doubt that yes, we have shot at them. So today, Frank continues to be involved in his UFO research, and he currently resides in Central Florida. And let me just bring him on before this show ends without me actually bringing him on.
Hello, Frank.
Hello,
Welcome.
everybody.
Welcome.
That was a long intro, Preston.
I always get in trouble, but I'm doing my best. And you have such a claim. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. Your resume is amazing. Well, there goes my mic.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, we had a big hurricane that hit down where I live here, and stuff got messed up. It's taken me weeks of putting the property back together again.
Oh, wow.
So I'm finally here.
Wow. And in one piece.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm well protected, believe me.
a crazy hurricane. Yeah, it actually went around me here. But whew, that was a big one.
Yeah, you guys are lucky.
Okay.
Hi, on with the show. Go, Preston.
we got a pretty big audience. So, yeah, I'm so glad you guys could all join us. And Frank, as I warned you before the show, because I never want to blindside a guest, I'm always very curious if you yourself have seen a UFO. Did you believe in UFOs growing up? What pathway led you to researching this topic? And how did you get to where you are today? In one sentence. No, I'm kidding.
4-part question. Yeah.
Actually, Preston, I kind of stumbled onto this whole Flatwoods Monster thing by accident. I have a cousin who owns some property in Frametown in Braxton County, which is a short distance away from Flatwoods, where the UFO incident took place. And I was up there visiting back in 1991, and that's when I came across this story about the Flatwoods Monster. I was going with my cousin into the town and saw this big sign on the side of the road, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And that was the beginning of the end.
Wow.
Over 30 years later, I'm still looking into this case.
So did you believe in UFOs at that point, or have you heard of them, or was it just not a topic?
A little bit growing up, just stuff you would read in the Weekly Reader or the books in the library. But being an illustrator, I was into other things, doing advertising, art, painting, doing murals, whatnot. And when I went into Braxton County, that's when I became a believer. My cousin had crop circle rings appearing on his property. Now you have to imagine his property is one of the highest points in Braxton County. He's up in the mountains. It's about a mile drive from the main road just to get to his home. Then when you hit the top of the peak where you would park your vehicle by the house, you would look out and there was 400 acres of sprawling property. There was actually a Civil War battle fought on the property.
Wow.
I was up there on one trip, and my cousin wasn't too happy because he had just purchased the property a handful of years before. He walked out one morning, and there's these giant crop circle rings burned into the property for about 100 acres, and he wasn't too happy over that.
I can imagine.
I started documenting them. They weren't like the crop circles that you normally would see in England. They were like rings. and there was quite a few of them. They would be anywheres from 2 feet across to 60, 70 feet across. And I started documenting them, and I started talking to some of the locals there, Preston. And long story short, that's when I discovered how all the locals up in that area were talking about flying saucers and UFOs. Well, the first time I was up there, we went to a little house gathering, and the people were talking about it, and I made the deadly mistake of laughing at them. Not good, because
I've been there. I did that. Yeah.
words I heard of is, boy, don't be laughing at us. You go up in those mountains at 3 o'clock in the morning and then come back and tell us what you see. Well, that's what I did. And I was a believer. I saw stuff up there that was amazing. The whole area of central Braxton County is a hotbed for UFO sightings. And I started documenting the crop circle rings. I didn't have a camera right at the beginning. This is back in the early 90s. So I started borrowing video cameras, which was a big thing back in the day, and getting some good film cameras. I started documenting everything, and I was still living in Connecticut at the time. And I lived outside of New Haven in the Bridgeport area. And a friend of mine had told me I should go to one of the MUFON meetings in Connecticut, which I did, and I met Colin Andrews.
Wow.
And I had a nice long talk with Colin. It was a group of people. We met at a big hotel, and we sat in a conference room. And after our meeting, I sat down and I talked with Colin for a good hour to hour and a half. And probably about a third of what he told me went over my head. Being a scientist. So I kept saying, come down on my level, and I'm going to show you some of what I have. So we talked for a bit, and I showed him all the photographs of the crop circle rings. And they were actually the first ones to ever come out of the mountains, because people weren't talking about it. And later on, I found out why they were being laughed at, because of the Flatwoods monster, the way the people up in Braxton County were treated when that case happened back in 1952.
Boy, that must have been quite a stressful thing for the whole town.
Yeah, they weren't too receptive. Not at all. I started nosing around, talking to different people, asking questions, and then I went to film school, is what you mentioned earlier, and I started getting real expensive cameras from the college, pro grade cameras, and I started bringing those up there, and that was a real head turner. When I would walk, I would never leave the cameras alone because they were quite a few $1,000s, and I would carry them wherever I went. And one time, first time I walked in with the big camera, it was about the size of a suitcase. I walked into Sutton, into a little mom and pop restaurant with about 40, 50 people. And it was just like you see in the movies. Everybody stopped to eat, and you can hear the clinging of forks. They all stopped, and they all turned and they looked at me. Like, who's this guy, or what's he carrying?
Out of towner.
Yeah, and I was with a friend, and at that point we ate, went outside, and a guy walked outside, and he walked up to me, and he flashed his coat open, and he says, "Boy, we don't talk about that Flatwoods monster around these parts no more." Ooh. And he opened up, and he had a gun on the inside of his chest. And he closed it back up, and I'm like, oh, man. I says, I'm going to have to start coming up here armed or have a bodyguard, which is eventually what I did anyways. But I wasn't too receptive at the beginning. And I was at a point where I almost gave everything up.
But technically, you are kind of connected to that area, so you do have a little bit of an in.
Yeah, but the people didn't know that at the beginning. After, with my cousin and family up there, but once I started talking to them, nobody could either remember or pronounce my name, my last name, which is Italian. So I just became known as Cousin Frank.
That works.
I was from Frametown, and they still call me that.
So before we get into the actual incident, because I'd love to do kind of a deep dive in that, can you just describe, this area, Braxton County, Flatwoods? Is there anything special about it? I mean, if UFOs are coming there in large numbers, there's got to be something drawing them there.
Well, it's the central part of the state. Flatwoods is the center part of the state, and very isolated. It's basically up in the mountains there. It still looks like it did in the Civil War. My cousin's house was actually part of a section where there was a gathering of men, and basically in the backyard there was a battle fought, and the house was still the same as it was in the Civil War. And he built up on it and modernized the place, but very isolated. I think that's why they're going there. Very isolated. I had seen them pressing. It got to the point where I would see him so often it got boring. Yeah, it got boring. It's like, oh, same old stuff. I don't even know. Dozens, hundreds of hours I've watched them. And
even mines up there,
pardon?
Is it a mining community at all?
There's no coal mines up in that area. Not
Right.
in that particular area. It's just wide, vast, open land and mountains. It's beautiful up there. A matter of fact, the opening sequence for the Monster Quest episode, when the camera pans from left to right, you could see the barn in the background. That was my cousin's property, and that's where all the crop circle rings were appearing. I had seen, I was actually signaled a UFO back in about 1992. I was with my mom on a trip up there. I told her I had seen the stuff up there, and she's, well, I got to see this to believe it. And I was talking to Colin Andrews, and he told me about using the amber-colored lights to attract them and putting the lights into a formation with the beams like a pyramid. Right. So I went out and got all this equipment and lights, and it looked like a circus up on top of the mountain there. And son of a gun, they showed up. And I actually signaled one that came across the Middle Ridge area from the north area to the south. When I had one of those big halogen, it looks like a big gun, like a bazooka. And when you hit the trigger, okay. And having no idea what was going on, I aimed this thing up towards the north area, and the thing was sitting there. And basically, it looked like a big fluorescent round bulb. It was a big round bulb, diffused at the end. And my mom was standing there with me, and she took the binoculars and she looked at it. And when she zoomed in on it, she said it's a disc with a dome on it, but you couldn't see it, with the naked eye because it was so bright and diffused. So crazy me takes the light, and I flashed at it and I hit it. And when I hit this thing, it started moving. And it started coming across the horizon, the Middle Ridge. And when I put the trigger up to it and I aimed at it and I hit it twice, it stopped. I'm like, wow, look at this. It's working. Then I hit it once again and it moved. And I did this for about close to 10 minutes. And I couldn't believe it. I said, wow, this is like contact. And when the thing moved across the horizon, Preston, and it got directly in my line of sight in front of me, it just sat there and hovered. And I'm like, well, what's going on now? It's not doing anything because it didn't go any further. So I flashed it a couple times, and you know what the thing did? Came directly at us.
Nice.
Well, that sounds like a successful CE5 long before CE5 was a thing, and it sounds better than most CE5s I've heard of.
Now, we got amber-colored lights and red lights, and I had the big lights into the shape of a pyramid like Colin Andrews had mentioned, all the ambers. We look like the Keystone Cops running around shutting all those lights off. It looked like almost my mom was in midair because I grabbed her by the arm and dragged her in the house. I says, we're not dealing with this. It was crazy. It came directly at us. Well, the following morning, Preston, my mom banged on the door of my bedroom there in my cousin's house. And she says, "Get your butt out here now." And I walked outside,
No.
half asleep, walked into the front yard, and she said, "Look at the horizon line." And when we saw it in daylight, that was scary because I did not realize how close that thing was when it came within a couple hundred yards of us. And
Wow.
that's when
That's
it got
definite
gorgeous.
contact.
And that's why I like, oh, I'm losing my nerve doing this stuff. Well, we
Yeah,
would
but
go,
you're still good at it.
yeah,
When you
but
do
we would
research,
go up into
she
the
will
back.
research you.
We would go up into the back, what we nicknamed Lookout Hill. And, you know, I would never go up there by myself, not in a million years, but we would go up there and we would just check out the UFOs and just watch them flying around. And they would go into formations. It was amazing. And I remember the first time my brother went up there, he just sat there and we looked at each other and were like, can you believe the government's telling us these things don't exist? And we're watching them flying around. They were on the horizon line. Then they would all come together in formations and go straight up like a button shirt. And then they would come down to go in formations. They were doing that so often, we got bored of watching it over the years. It was like, it's nothing anymore. We're seeing the same old stuff.
We do that to let people know that this is, definitely them, and not some, plane or anything like that. Wow, that's amazing. That's very cool.
Yeah, that went on for a few years, and then I talked with Colin quite a few times, and I was always sending him video footage and photographs. And then when I got involved into the Flatwoods case, that kind of went south, and I just concentrated on Flatwoods monster story.
Well, I'm certainly glad you did. Here, I'm going to pull up the book so that people can get a look at this. This is the book that covers the Flatwoods incident, Braxton County incident, and so much more. So this is, I know, a very complicated story. It's not just one incident, but it certainly started out with this amazing, why don't you just lead us into what happened on that day?
When I first got involved in the story, living in Connecticut, I was going back and forth there before I moved to Florida and went to film school. Well, while up in Connecticut, I was hitting all the libraries throughout the state, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, and everything in between, all the major libraries. And I was visiting bookstores and looking in the metaphysical section for UFO books. No internet back then. Everything was, boots on the ground researching. And I found unbelievable amounts of information about the Flatwoods monster case. And no two stories were alike. And they were all little short stories. And they didn't make sense. And one book would have, there was 3 kids playing on the football field. And then another one said there were 5 kids. And I remember the first time I talked to Kathleen May, the primary witness who saw the monster from a few feet away, I brought that up to her and she started laughing. And she says, "Frank, think about it. How you going to have a football game on a Friday night with 3 kids?" She said the whole town was up there. There was, 15, 20 kids up there. So it just goes to show what poor reporting did and killed this story over the years.
Yeah,
and Kathleen May was the first one I actually worked with, Preston. She was the primary witness. She's the one that led the crew of boys up there when they saw the Flatwoods monster.
Cool. Well, here I'm going to bring up a picture of some of her and the witnesses. So your book, by the way, is beautifully illustrated. Really loved how you got so much documentation of all of this and speaking to the witnesses firsthand. So yeah, tell us what happened. This is such an amazing incident.
It was about, it was September 12th, 1952. Now, a key part of the story is that Flatwoods is a geographical center of the state of West Virginia, in Braxton County. Well, there was all of this group of schoolboys was playing on Flatwoods Elementary School playground. and it was just before 7:30 that night. Now it was Indian summer, so it was quite warm. The leaves really hadn't turned yet, and it was basically like a minor heat wave. It was quite warm over, across the mid-Atlantic portion of the country that night. And all these kids are out there, they're throwing a football around, they're playing, and all of a sudden a couple of the kids looked up and they looked to the northern sky, and one of the kids says, "Look up there." And when they looked over the top of the trees of the mountain, the school was basically in a little gully area, and they saw this big fireball shooting across the mountain, and it came across the mountaintop, flew over their heads of where the playground was. It made a 45-degree angle turn, unlike a meteor,
Yeah.
flew across the main road, and it flew over onto the hilltop on a nearby farm, which was the Bailey Fisher farm. Well, all these kids saw this. The game stopped instantly. A bunch of the kids were curious. A couple of the younger kids thought it was maybe a meteor. One kid said it maybe it's a saucer. They didn't really know what it was. And in central West Virginia at that time, I was told, and I knew this already by the reporter who broke the story, that there was only a couple TV sets in all of Braxton County in that area, and everybody basically would have like a little radio. There was only a couple cars in the area. This, I don't want to say depressed, but the people lived happy, and they basically lived off the land. It was a little general store, kind of like Mayberry, little small society like that. So these group of kids go running up the street, and they turn past the train depot, and they go up an incline, and they ran to the house of Kathleen May. Two of the boys in the group, that was their mom. The reason they went there, because Depot Street was the access road that led up to the farm. Now, they saw this thing touch down on the far back of the farm on the plateau of a mountaintop. It wasn't a pointed mountaintop. It was a plateau, and they saw this thing come down. Give me a second. This is not in my book, but this is my illustration in full color. Let me get this right.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Right.
That's the plateau of the mountaintop where the thing touched down. And you could see, Preston, it's basically like an oval shape. Okay. And this thing dropped out of the sky.
Wow. Great art.
Dropped out of sight, and the boys ran up. Some of the kids chickened out. I actually talked to one guy who became a newspaper publisher, and he said it was the biggest mistake of my life. He says, I didn't go up there and see it. Him and a bunch of the boys chickened out, the younger kids, and they went home. So in the end, there was a group of people. There were 7. It was Kathleen May, her 2 sons, and the other kids that you saw in that picture. And the oldest kid was Gene Lemon. That was her cousin. And he was 18 years old. Some sources say 17. He was 17, 18 years old. And he was a National Guardsman. Him and Kathleen, they each grabbed a flashlight. Now, there's another inconsistency in the story. Half of the stories have it that Kathleen had the flashlight. Half of them say that Lemon had it. Well, they both had flashlights. And when I talked to Kathleen May, I wanted to know. And she says, Frank, the 2 adults grabbed the flashlight. She said, especially when it was starting to get dark, walking into the mountains, if one of the flashlights went out, you were in trouble. So Kathleen and her cousin Gene Lemon, they led the pack, and there was a couple family dogs. Gene Lemon had his little dog there, and there was another dog who was Freddie May's dog. And the reason I'm telling you this, because this comes into play later. They're all going up the hill to the back. And in the meantime, across the road, there was a collie, a big collie dog that followed the kids up. They would play. Everybody was in the neighborhoods. Everybody knew each other back then, in the days when you could leave your doors unlocked. So what happened is They walk up into the back portion of the property, and the first area that they hit is a flat area, and that's what I call the first field, Preston. The
Right.
group walked across the first field, and I think we got one or two pictures there of the field it's a long shot of the farm.
All right. I'll see if I can pull that up. Here, give me just a
Okay,
second.
and the group was walking across the farm of the first field. They hit a gate, which was a big metal cattle gate. And just beyond that was a dirt path. And I think you have some pictures of that too. The
All
dirt
right.
path led all the way up to the far back mountaintop. To the right is a second field. Okay. Way in the far back, there's the mountaintop where I just showed you my illustration. The second field is in front of that mountaintop, and it's a big gully. And there was a fruit orchard section in the far back of the farm. And that is the second field of the gully. I think you may have a picture of that. But, anyways, we have the first field, which was flat, the second field, which is the gully off to the right, and the gate. The group unwired the gate, and what you're supposed to do, they didn't know if there were animals up there at that point, or horses or cattle. So they all crossed the gate and they wired it. They started, right there it is there. They walked past the first gate, and you see where that pole is to the left? That was the second fence. And back then, that had slats of wood going from post to post. That's the remains of it. That was shot during the Monster Quest show. Well, they climbed over that fence there. It wasn't a gate, right? You see the post to the left? That went all the way to the right, and there was another post there, and it was hammered shut. So Kathleen May crossed over, and the collie dog ran ahead. And some of the other boys started following her and up behind, and they started noticing this real rancid smell. And the witnesses told me it smelled like sulfur and similar to the old tubes that would burn out in the backs of radios, that burning smell. And off in the distance, a couple of the witnesses told me, okay, there's the overview of the farm. There's the first field. The second field is just beyond that little white fence. That little white fence wasn't there at the time. It was brush. And what happened in the meantime, Preston, is by the time the kids walked across the first field, crossed the metal gate, and started going up the path, the object that touched down in the far back of the property, it lifted off and it relocated into the back. See the far back there? The far back of the property where it's real sloped in that gully? That's where the thing touched down and it sat there, so it wasn't as conspicuous. Now there was a lot of brush through that area, and this place is all cleaned up now. But back in 1952, that whole farm was overgrown, and it wasn't taken care of as well. And the grass was like anywhere from 2 to 3 feet high, waist high. So this thing that relocated and landed in the far back, a couple of the adults got a glimpse of it when they were walking up there. They saw something over to the side. Some of the boys remember hearing something like a droning noise that sounded like something that was rotating and unwinding. Drone. Well, Freddie May worked at Union Carbide in Charleston. And when he was an adult, he told me the first time he heard those big generators shutting down with that droning circular noise, he said he got a flashback to when he was a kid, because that's a similar sound that he heard that night. And it was actually the craft that he heard. Most of the kids didn't see it because they were short and the place was so overgrown with brush along the tree, they couldn't see. So I'm setting the stage for them. They're walking up. It's starting to get dark. They have to walk all the way up to the back where they saw this thing touch down. They get about halfway up. There's a swag, a bend, and that's where you saw the black and white picture earlier. As they started nearing the area, the collie dog let out a screaming yelp, and it turned around and it hightailed from the area where the smell was emanating. And at this point, there was like a low-laying mist fog that was coming across the whole dirt path, and they kept pushing on. Mrs. May and some of the older boys were leading the pack, and there was a couple of the kids that hadn't passed by that wooden gate yet. And Mrs. May told me when she started nearing the area of this oak tree, and I think you have some pictures of the oak tree.
Yeah.
And I have a picture of me standing in front of it.
Yeah, I remember that one. Hold on a sec. I'll find it.
That was the remains of the oak tree. The oak tree was set back approximately 4 feet off of the dirt path. What it basically was, Preston, is when that dirt path was made, they dug right into the earth, and it was like concave, and they cut this swath. And back of me is the path, okay? Facing the opposite direction. And that's about a 3 to 4 foot drop. Well, as they started getting closer, the smell and that foggy mist started getting thicker. And as Mrs. May approached up towards the tree, she said it sounded like frying bacon and a low thumping noise that sounded kind of was like a conga drum. But she said it was more like hitting a silver dollar onto a stretched canvas, like a thumping rhythmic noise. And as she heard all of these crazy crackling, she said it sounded like frying bacon in a pan. Okay, there's the tree there. See how there's a slope?
Right.
And it's back a few feet off of the path. Right about there, when I took that picture, Preston, that's about where Kathleen May was. Now, right behind that tree was the Flatwoods monster. And it was sitting on the ground, and the Flatwoods monster was actually a machine. It was a craft like a small spaceship. They didn't know what it was because this thing was hidden behind that tree. They got a couple feet closer, and Jean Lemon and Kathleen shined their flashlights up into the area about close to 12 foot high. There was a branch up there, and that branch came out over the path. Okay. The monster, which here's your Flatwoods monster. This is a model that I made of the monster.
Amazing.
Okay. See how it looks like a rocket ship?
Yep.
Okay. The lower portion had pipes on it, and it was part of a propulsion system. This thing was sitting behind the tree, and it was blowing this exhaust out, and it was also leaking. Mrs. May said as she got closer towards the tree, her and Lemon shined the flashlight up. They thought they saw eyes of a raccoon or a possum. They didn't know what it was. And when the whole area lit up, that's what hovered out. It lifted up and passed in front of the witnesses. And you can see the tree there to the left. There's the wooden gate towards the foreground left corner. And Kathleen May told me she was as close to it as the length of a car, a small car. So she was approximately 12 feet from it. It basically moved right out in front of her. Jean Lemon fell over. He dropped his flashlight. Kathleen said he just got rubbery legged. It scared the hell out of him. Turned around and they took off. Kathleen said we got a real good look at it. And you could see that there's beams of light coming out. A lot of writers over the years had described those as like X-ray or beams of laser beams. What that actually was, Preston, that was not a face. That was an inner helmet, and it had two porthole eyes in it. And the witnesses told me when this thing lit up, it reacted. And that's what I was really wanting to know from Kathleen May. When this thing was near you, it was dormant and they couldn't tell. It was starting to get dark. And the thing is set off to the side where the backdrop is the woods. The woods were that whole area down there. And that thing lifted and hovered out and came down the path in front of Kathleen. And it was spewing oil out. She said the oil hit her in part of the face, hit her chest, and she had a little hat on. Back in the day, she was a beautician, and they used to wear their uniform hats. So she got splattered with this oil. They all got a good whiff of this stuff, and they were sick. They turned and they hightailed it. Freddie May and one of the younger boys was at the far back where the wooden gate is. They saw this unfold in front of them. The rest of the group was up close, the older boys. Well, Mrs. May said she got a real good look at it, and we just ran. And what was great about working with Kathleen and working with her son, Freddie, is Freddie saw the whole thing unfold from the gate. So he had an overall view of what was in front of him.
Wow.
Okay. Kathleen saw this thing from approximately 12 feet. So she got an up close and personal look at this thing. So when I was doing my illustrations over the years, I would sit down with the witnesses. Being an illustrator, this is what Stanton Friedman loved. He told me, he says, Frank, this case never would have got solved by anybody else except an artist, because I sat down and did police-style renderings with these people.
Wonderful.
And I was able to distinguish what this thing actually looked like, because the press and the television completely botched the whole thing up and had this thing looking like this, like a monster with arms and claws. Red face. Here's another one, a statue that they make, Preston. See it?
Yeah.
Okay. This is this famous statue that they make. Well, this represents a dress. What this actually was, the misinterpretation, the pleats. Mrs. May said this thing reminded her of the pleats of a dress, or like the drapes, how they hang down and they're rolled. Back in 1952, she's trying to describe this metallic figure, 12 foot tall. She had no reference point. So she said the lower point reminded her of a dress or drapes, the way they come down and they were folded. They were actually pipes.
Oh.
And you could see there the thing lifted off the ground, and it didn't make any threatening maneuver towards her. It basically moved across the path. Now, the interesting point is when this thing had landed and it relocated into the gully, you could see there's a slope back there. This thing was to the far left and back of where the figure would have been, actually right there. And when it hovered out of the craft, it moved across the field and it cut a path. Now, earlier I said the grass was about 3 to 4 feet high. And when this cut through the field, Preston, it was actually like if you walked with a big giant leaf blower and you walked
All right.
and it cut a path as it went through. And this thing was gigantic. I was told it was approximately 4.5 foot at the base. The bottom of this was about 4 feet at the base, and it tapered up. And Freddie May told me the area of the shoulders was about 3 feet across. and the arms and the claws that have been misportrayed for over 70 years were actually antennas. See the antennas?
Wow.
And when Mrs. May was given the description, she said they look like little hands, like claws coming out. And nobody really knew what she meant, so they turned it into a monster. When I spoke to the other witnesses and I sat down with her son, Freddie, and I asked him what they were, he said, Frank, what mother was talking about, those little spike things that were coming out, he said they were antennas. Antennas coming off of the plane of the shoulders. So what happened is all of these years later, everybody who hasn't read the book or seen my paintings think the Flatwoods monster is a silly little monster with arms and claws. And I sat down with the witnesses and I would do tons of drawings. Give me a second. Give me a second there.
Your time. This is amazing. Here, I'll pull this up here. I can't imagine what it must have been like to see something that big and then have it spew oil all over you.
Now, the thing was, Preston, back then, the nickname of it was the Green Monster. And nobody could figure out why the monster was green. Well, what it actually was is because it was still warm and it was an Indian summer, unseasonably warm for that time of year. The leaves had not turned yet. And all the green leaves in the area, when the crack, that's what it was. It was a small crack. When it lit up from the inside, it reflected the greenery, reflected light. I learned that in my first year of art school, it reflected light. So when I did my paintings, that was the green monster because it was reflecting its environment around it.
So can I ask, do you know, was there anything in this machine, or is this just part of a ship that landed, or just like a drone that came from the mothership somewhere?
Well, that's what I didn't understand back in the early days, Michelle. As I started looking further into this case, I actually came across a little story in one of Jacques Vallée's books about this monster seen the following night, which was the Frametown incident. And I went through hell and high water to find the original source of that. Now, we're talking back in 1992, 93. No internet. Everything I did was libraries, going to book shows, megacons, that type of big, comic book, magazine, and collectible shows. Well, I knew where the article was. It was in a 1955 article, and it was a men's magazine that basically concentrated on hunting and fishing and some paranormal stories. It was called Male Magazine. And it was from 1955. Well, I went nuts looking for this thing, and it was like 1,000,000 to 1 shot. God set this thing down for me because I drove to Orlando from Daytona, and I went to this massive comic book show. I had no idea. It was like I was led there. Very uncanny. I walked the whole show. I walked into the back of the room, and there was a dealer there from New Jersey, of all places, right? And he had about 10,000 magazines, life magazines, men's magazines, girl magazines, hunting magazine, everything you can imagine. Well, I walked up to him and I says, I'm looking for the July 1955 issue of Male Magazine. I says, I'm researching the story and there's an article in there. I said, do you have any idea if you have it? And Preston, I'll never forget, he said, probably not, because 99% of the people that are looking for something, I never have it. He said, well, let's stop. And he started looking through all the boxes. And I didn't even know what the cover looked like. I had no idea what the cover looked like. And he dug through and he pulled it out, and I didn't recognize it. And I said, can we open it up and look in there? It's something about a West Virginia monster with a UFO story. And it had a cowboy on the cover with his guns, like an old Western cowboy. He opened it up. He went down the index, and I could still picture him. And he says, there it is, the West Virginia monster.
Hmm.
And I'm like, wow, there's not too many of these. And I bought it. And
Mm.
came back home. I researched that story and I picked it apart. It was the full blown story. It was written by Paul Lieb, and he was involved with a Saucer Society, I believe, from California. He interviewed George Snatowski, who was the witness to the Frametown Monster. Okay, it took place about 24 hours later in Frametown, and he was driving along with his wife back to New York from Ohio, and his car stalled out. He had his wife was in the front seat, and the back seat was their youngster. It was a baby boy, and back then they didn't have child seats, and the baby was in a crib. So the car died out. He's on the side of the road, and he looked out in the distance, and he saw this pulsing UFO out in the light. It was like a phosphorus color, and it kind of had a violet hue to it. And Kathleen May told me the night before, as she was walking up the first area of the path, when she came up the incline, she saw something flare out. And she said it was like a purplish hue. So I'm like, okay, now we got a couple common things going on here. Then he got out of the car and he smelled this horrific gas that smelled like sulfur. Sound familiar? Same thing. Same exact thing. He started choking and gagging. The wife is starting to get nervous. The car's down. It's dark. They're in the middle of nowheres. No lights. The car battery's dead. The baby starts screaming and crying. So he locks the car up, rolls the windows back up. He starts walking out to where this light was. He thought a chemical factory was on fire. He didn't know where he was. You're in the middle of the boondocks in Frametown. And as he's walking out into that area, he started nearing this object. And he said that there was like 1 million prickles of low voltage electricity going through his body. And it was affecting him. And he started inhaling this gas. And as he turned, he fell down on his knee and he vomited. The sickness got to him. It was overwhelming. Same thing like what happened with Kathleen and the boys. Well, as he's walking back, I'm giving you the short version because we could talk for 2 hours about this, Preston. Walking back towards the car, he's backing away from the electrical voltage hitting his body. He's getting away from the smell. As he starts getting back towards the car, his wife had rolled the window down and she starts screaming like Fay Ray when she saw King Kong in the King Kong movie. And she yelled out something to the effect of, George, look out, it's behind you. And George, he's half dazed. He's sick. He turned around and he looked over his shoulder, and you have the illustration there of the black and white encounter with George.
Or I'm not sure which one it is. I know it's not this one, right?
Nope.
Okay, let me see. I'll see if I can find it.
This is what he saw.
Here, hold on.
Wow.
Okay.
I have a black and white small one. It's a black and white, and this is coming up behind him. And he's got his arms up.
Right here.
Another illustration of it.
That's scary.
That's quite.
This is probably it without the outer covering.
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
That's the first thing that hit me. Well, there's another one there too of the encounter where it's coming up behind him.
All right. I'll see if I can find that one. Give me a second. I'm still doing my best to navigate all of these. We got quite a few images here.
It's
Oh,
similar, but definitely makes you wonder, is that what was inside the other one, or is just an upgraded version?
Well, they've got to be
Or-
connected. Come on. I mean, it's
Yeah.
24 hours. It looks almost exactly the same.
Oh my God.
Here we
Yeah.
go.
Or is it just how they're perceived? That's crazy.
That's it.
Yeah, that's crazy.
George actually saw the creature inside the suit. I actually tracked the craft after it departed the Fisher farm.
Mm.
I started using some of the local newspapers, Preston, and talking to the locals. It followed the Elk River after it departed Flatwoods, went along the Elk River, and it landed in Frametown on a area called James Knoll or James Knob. And this happened a short distance away from it. And I spoke to a woman who actually saw the craft go down, and that's where the opening sequence of Monster Quest was shot from, the area of James Knob. It was the James family.
Mhm.
Well, George turned around and he saw this thing, and he said his knees buckled. And
I can
he
understand that.
dashed back to the car, and this thing started following him back. And he's gagging. You have to picture the scene. His wife is going bloody hysterical, screaming. The baby's freaked out. She grabbed the baby, pulled the baby over the seat, and she was huddling onto the baby and covering its mouth because the gas is going through the air. It's sneaking through into the vehicle. Well, when George got into the car, he opened up, he jumped inside, and he grabbed big like hunting butcher knife he had in his glove box. He pushed his wife. Now this is an early 50s car, big front seats, big area underneath the dashboard. He pushed his wife down underneath the glove box. Are there even glove boxes in new cars anymore, Preston?
There are.
Her down. She's holding the baby, and he jumped on top of her, and he pushed down on her to protect her, male instinct, and he had this big ass knife in his hand. Well, they were cowering, and he said, if there was ever a time I was praying in my life, this was it. He was praying, and he said his heart was going like a sledgehammer. Okay. I actually sent George Snatowski some of my research. He lived in Queens, New York, and I had somebody track his address down, and I sent him some of my research. And I had a return receipt, the little green receipt to send back to make sure he got it. I waited a little while, and it was in December, right about this time now, and I called him up, and I actually spoke to him on the phone as a cold call, and that was a shock to him. I wanted to know if this story was a bunch of malarkey, was it made up, was it science fiction, or what the story was. And I had an idea it was real because I had to go nuts trying to find his address and his telephone number. I had somebody get it for me who does that kind of work. So I'm talking to him. He was shocked that I tracked him down after this was 1993, all these years later. So I ran over the story with him. I wanted to know if it was true. And he said, everything I told Paul Lieb back in 1959 is true. And you could take that to the bank. Well, I wanted to know a little bit more details about what this thing looked like. And basically, because I knew it had long, spindly arms that were forked into like what was two fingers. It didn't have a thumb. And it was disjointed the way that the arms were. And here, we'll show you here. Oh, you got that there. And here he is here.
Well,
See the fingers?
Mhm.
oh, yep. Yep.
And he said it kind of had a bloated body, the big head, like coned in the back. And as I'm talking to him, I'm doing sketches. I wanted to get a telephone interview with him, but I didn't want to do anything illegal and record him because I couldn't use it. But I asked him if he would do a telephone interview with me from New York to my house in Florida, where I was living at that time. And he didn't want to do it, Preston. He said, I went through hell at work. He had a high position job. He was a businessman. He says, I went through hell with this story. So did my wife. He says, I will tell you a little bit more. A long story short, I want to know what this thing looked like. And it kind of looked like a snake, like a reptilian. It didn't have a big face like you would see in the Gorn in Star Trek, like a T-Rex, more like a flat face, and it was more like a snake.
Here, I need to stop you there for just a second.
Pardon?
I need to stop you for just a second so we can do a quick station ID break and call out the station
Technical stuff.
Yeah.
The job part of everything. Yeah. Everything else is fun.
This is great, Frank. This is absolutely amazing. But I want to let everyone know you're watching the Lightgate, episode 86. I'm your host, Preston Bennett. My lovely co-host tonight is taking Dolly Saffron's place. It's Michelle Desrochers. You can find her on The Outer Realm each Wednesday and Thursday evening, 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern, along with Emilia Pisano. And I want to let you know that we are streaming on several platforms. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network at 107.7 FM and 105.3 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. We are on Roku. We are on Facebook. We are on YouTube. So check out these platforms. I want to give a huge shout out to Carnation. We love you. Thank you for supporting us. We truly appreciate it. It definitely helps. And you guys are absolutely wonderful in chat. I do see a few questions.
I just want to make, Preston, I want to make mention that you're also on Rumble live. And for those who are not used to Rumble, you can comment in Rumble and we can see your comments here and we can put them right up on the screen, just like you've been watching throughout the evening. Sorry, Preston.
No, thank you. Did I skip Rumble? Darn it.
That's why I'm here.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. But yeah, we've been talking all about the amazing 1952 Braxton County incident, also known as the Flatwoods, Virginia monster, and Frank Feschino's amazing work into this. Check out his book, The Braxton County Monster. Make sure you get the updated and revised edition. The link is in the show notes. If you can get it from Lulu, that would be awesome. But yeah, also check out his book, Shoot Them Down, which we haven't gotten into. Frank, I'm hoping maybe we can get you back because I'm not sure we're going to have time to get into all the details of all of this. This is amazing. I don't think people realize just how profound this case is with so many witnesses, animal reactions, landing traces, physiological evidence, and we haven't even gotten into the whole government response to this, which is another fascinating aspect to all of this. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That was an amazing encounter, the Frametown incident. So this has to be related to the other one, right?
Well, what was described to me, this thing, he said, was about a good 8 to 9 feet tall. Okay. The Flatwoods monster was described as approximately 12 feet tall. So I did different sketches of this thing. Now, what he actually saw was the flesh and blood of this creature from the waist up. Okay. When he got back into the car with his wife, and when he was praying and he was leaning down, covering them, he had no idea where this thing was. It had went around the car. Okay. And it came to the front of it. Okay. Now he's anticipating. He has no idea. And I wouldn't have been looking up too, because I'm not one of those idiots that would have walked down the hallway in a haunted house if I saw or heard something.
I'm like myself.
I did it once. I did it once, never again. He lifted his head up and he looked up across the dashboard upwards, and this is what he saw.
Oh, holy
Oh,
smoke.
This
boy.
is my sculpture that I did from
Wow.
George Snitowski's description. And it's
Wow.
close to scale. You know, you could see, you got a fix on that? This
Yes.
is what it was described as. There was like a snake-like reptilian with teeth, and it had the bigger head in the back. And I did this from my sketches after I talked to him.
Yeah.
That was actually the cover of the UFO magazine. That's him there in the
The
wood.
slit eyes too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That is
So
amazing.
he looked up across the dashboard and saw this thing looking down at him. And what it did is it reached out with those long, spindly arms, and it reached down and it touched the hood of his car. And other people have said to me over the years since they read the book, it never made a threatening maneuver towards them. It was almost like it was trying to contact them.
Hmm.
That's just a couple dozen people have said that to me since they read my book. But anyways, when it touched the hood of the car, it burnt the paint right down to the primer, and it left a scar on the hood of the car.
Wow.
He, at that point, they almost had a heart attack. The baby was going hysterical, crying. The wife's whimpering. He's having a heart attack, and he hid back down, and the thing backed off. And he looked up a few seconds later, and it had turned around, and it hovered like this. The night before was hovering, and it was the same thing. The propulsion system, which you figure whatever this was, it was some type of an exhaust. This thing was 12 foot high when it was seen in Flatwoods. When he saw it from the waist up, and he described this as one big solid mass on the bottom. It hovered back out into the woods towards that light that was hovering out there. He said when it disappeared and vanished into the darkness in the direction where that light was, he said the thing lifted up. And you know this well, Preston. How many times have you heard the stories where it starts swinging like a pendulum?
Yep.
And he said this back in 1955. Okay. What he saw in 52, he said it swung back and forth a few times like a pendulum and just took off and disappeared into the stars. Well, the thing about this whole case is the Flatwoods monster story did not break on the following day. Unless you were in the area, you didn't know about it. It broke in one newspaper out of Charleston on Sunday morning. So people on the outside of Flatwoods or Braxton County didn't even know what happened. This guy was driving from Ohio after visiting people there, took the back roads, and he was going back to Queens, New York. The story hadn't even broken with Flatwoods yet, so he didn't know anything about it. So I'm looking at all these similarities with the smells, the size, and I did some sketches when I sat down and I did cutaways. And if you take a 9-foot tall figure, okay, take the helmet off, okay, the inside was actually red, and it was an inner helmet. Kathleen and Freddie Mae told me it was like a helmet. Freddie described it to me. He said it looked like a fighter pilot sitting in the cockpit of his plane. The mask and the visor and everything was actually the inside. The outer covering, which what they said was shaped like an ace of spades, was actually an outer helmet. And I was told It had a plate glass window in the front that was like plexiglass. It was like a barrier shield.
Wow.
So I did all of these sketches. I'm working with this thing. I worked very close with Freddie, very close with him. He tolerated me. And I worked with Kathleen May, and I kept doing my illustrations. And I would mail them back and forth to the family. And then I finally got to the point where, give me a second, Preston. Give me a second.
Okay.
There's your Flatwoods monster.
Wow. I'm so glad you're an artist because this really brings it to life.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
And it hovered back across the field, and it followed a parallel path, like walking through the snow with your footprints. It made cut a swath going up to the tree, and when it passed in front of May and Lemon and the boys, it followed, went over the bushes, and went back and made a parallel path. And this is the whole overview. Let me see, everything's in reverse of the farm.
It looks right from there.
Yeah, yeah. Incredible.
Wow.
Incredible.
And this is what I did. Now, I brought the original painting. I got hold of Ailey Stewart Jr., who was the man who broke the story to the world. He was the first person of authority. Him and his dad owned the Braxton Democrat newspaper. He got a call from the West Virginia State Police the night this accident happened. After Mrs. May went back to her house with all the boys, they got into the house and it was pretty much hysterical.
To say the least.
Wonder why. Yeah.
He called up the sheriff's department. The sheriff was out with his deputy running around Braxton County chasing what were said to be downed aircraft going down in flames. They were UFOs. They got hold of the West Virginia State Police. They were out on call too. Now, I was told by another witness, I work with a lot of the old timers, who most of them are deceased now. So I have them on either video or audio. I had them drawing pictures and signing press releases. I have all types of stuff. And they said there would be only 1 or 2 state police that would cover the whole of Braxton County, which was a big area. They were out on call, and it was never disclosed where they were. I could never find out because they were actually part of the cover-up. They're the ones that put this whole ball in motion, I found out. Well, Ailey Stewart was a photographer, and he was a photojournalist. He had the big fancy camera. The police would work with him when they would go to crime scenes and accidents. And he worked with the police pretty regular, taking, where they would chalk the bodies out, and he would take the pictures for the police. So they knew him. They called him because there was no authority there. So he represented the police department and the state police. He went to the home of Kathleen May, and he was the first one that walked into the home. And he said it was utter pandemonium. He said everybody was crying. Gene Lemon was throwing up, almost passing out. They had to give him smelling salts. The boys, some of them, they were bleeding from the nose from inhaling. Okay. Some of them were cut up because they were falling down through the rocks and going down the path. And he said Mrs. May's eyes were all red and what he said weepy. And she was tearing from the gas that she had inhaled and everything. And she was covered with this oil, which shows you Flatwoods Monster was a machine. It was leaking. The thing was damaged. Okay. He came back into the neighborhood, and he tried to get a couple of the boys to go back up there. Good luck. He went up with one of the boys, and he said he had to he says he put his hand around his neck, the back of his neck, and he said he was crying like a whipped puppy. He would not go up. They got Mrs. May's dad went up with a shotgun. Stewart always carried a handgun or had a gun in the back of his truck or his car, wherever he was driving that day. And they formed a posse. This is how serious this thing was. There was no playing around. A West Virginia posse went up onto the mountaintop hunting for this thing. They stayed up there for about 45 minutes. They spotlighted around. Stewart told me he had what they called an electric lantern that you would hold. And he said we spotlighted around the farm. The boy eventually, when they got to the area, he showed him the tree where the thing was. And then they spotlighted around and he saw the trail marks from the impressions where the thing had hovered across the field. And they were walking around, and Stewart told me, he said, after about 45 minutes, we left because none of us were inclined to hunt for something in the dark. We didn't know what it was. Even the adults were scared when they saw what the kids were like, and then they saw all of these trace landing marks. They saw some of the oil. Well, anyways, they all went back down to the house, and he asked Kathleen if he could come back up the following day with a tape recorder. He got the tape recorder from the local theater that they had. You know, we're spoiled today, like all the old timers told me, you know, with all the electronic equipment and phones and everything. Even when I started investigating back then, there were no cell phones. So everything was like, so I was like back in the 50s. So I really knew what it was like back then. And all the old timers kept stressing to me what it was like up there. Now it's completely different. You know, there's McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chickens, hotels. It's like a big tourist spot up there now. But even back then when I was there, what I actually did, Preston, is I went with a friend and I retraced the whole entire area. I used some of Gray Barker and Ivan Sanderson's original notes and recordings. I combined them with all of my years of research, and I retraced every minute of what happened up there that night. And we drove around with the odometer and tracked how many miles and how long it took to go from point A to B and all over. And I did that quite a few times. That's how we was able to establish a solid timeline. Then I was working with Kathleen May, and she said, Frank, you have to talk to the colonel. I said, who's the colonel? She says, well, everybody up here calls him Colonel Levitt, but I call him Dale. Colonel Dale Levitt, United States Army, who still lived up there. And I spoke to him before he passed away in the mid-90s. He actually was up there for crowd control. They estimated in the first few weeks after the story broke that there's Colonel Levitt there. Approximately 10,000 people went into Braxton County. That's a lot of people. 300 people in the town. They just trampled that town to death. Colonel Levitt was up there with the National Guard for crowd control. Stewart had broke the story through the Charleston Gazette, and when it hit Sunday morning, and then Monday it hit the news wires and shotgun around the world as far as Europe and Japan and all the United States. And this is in 1952, which was the summer of the saucers, that you know had the most sightings.
Now, how many people did you say were in the town? You cut out. How big was the town? How many people were in it?
Approximately 300 people.
300. 10,000 came.
Yeah, that's what the guesstimates were, approximately 10,000. Okay. And Ailey Stewart told me that his office in Sutton was basically the hub of where all the reporters and newspaper and people came from around the world. They went to his office. So he basically had control of the whole thing. Kathleen May was just hammered to death with people coming into town. she told me she didn't even want to talk to anybody after the first week. It was like hundreds of people wanted to interview her and talk to her. Well, what happened is she went down a week after the encounter. She was contacted by the television show in New York called We the People. It was
Is
an
this her?
NBC. Yeah, that's me with Kathleen May. That's one of the earlier times. That was in her son's house. And I would sit down. As a matter of fact, I was doing some drawings that time there. Yep, that's Kathleen May.
Amazing.
And it's a good thing that I had spoke to all of these people all over the years, because most of them are all passed away now, Preston.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyways, Kathleen said, you got to talk to Dale. And we call him the Colonel. So I'm like, well, I'm not too well liked up in this area to go out to get hold of a colonel who was a World War II hero. I said, can you make a phone call for me, Kathleen? And at this point, I had met her, a few times, and we started opening up. I was showing her my research. So she called him up, and he agreed to talk to me. Well, it's well known through the newspapers and different articles that Colonel Levitt was up there for crowd control. Well, when I met Colonel Levitt up there the first time, I was with my mom. Okay. We picked Colonel Levitt up at his home in Sutton. There's another shot, and there's Kathleen May. And we went onto the farm, and we basically started from Kathleen May's house right up to the point where across the first field, we opened up the gate, which was still there, walked across, and we got up to the tree area. And as we're talking, I'm asking Colonel Levitt about his crowd control, Preston. And he says, well, Frank, he says, I wasn't up here just for crowd control. I got a call from Washington, D.C. that night. And I almost froze. And I remember I looked at him and I said, I thought you were up here with your troops because all the people were here and pestering the locals. He says, no, he got a call from Washington, D.C., and he was ordered up to go onto the farm. And I'm like, really? He wouldn't let me tape record him. So when he spilled his guts there, that's when I became a pain in the neck. I said, I got to get this guy on tape, audio, something or other. Well, long story short, I'm walking across the farm with him. My mom took a couple photographs of us together, and one of them's in the book, and they're on my website and Facebook. And we talked a little longer. I was taking notes. I had a little pad. I'm taking notes down. We dropped the colonel back off, and from that point forward, I was a pain in the neck, Preston. I've said this a couple times before. I was calling him because, I'm back down. I'm in Florida. I'm calling the guy up being a pain in the neck. I'm writing him letters. When I would go into visit my cousin in Frametown, we would just pop in and bang on his door. Looking at me.
It's not easy being a UFO researcher.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, I'm digging up all the materials, and I'm finding articles. Preston, I have dozens of books like this, thousands of pages, thousands of pages on the Flatwoods case. And I kept showing it to him. I was showing it to Kathleen May. And finally, I gave a last-ditch effort. I was really getting sick of trying to get him onto tape. And I went over there with a friend of mine, and he came out I remember he came out from behind the screen door. And this was my Hail Mary Doug Flutie pass. It was now or never. And it's so many words, which I can't repeat here, because I basically said, you are the nuts of my story. I said, they have been making fools out of your people. I said, Colonel, that everybody called him Colonel. I said, Colonel, these are your people, not mine. I says, I'm kind of representing these people and the families. Do you want them to go down as fools and knuckleheads in the history books forever? I said, because nobody's got it right. They've been screwing the story up for years. I says, I know it, you know it. I said, if we don't do this, the story's shot. I'm just going to give up. You'll never see me again. And I said, I said a couple man words to him and go to him. And he just looked at me point blank, and I'm like, uh-oh. And he was I was like, taller than him, and I was still scared of him. He looked up at me, and he says, I'll think about it. And he said a couple other words. Well, he eventually contacted me, and he said, I will do a taped interview with you.
Hmm.
And at that point, I went with my cousin, and we picked him up. I had a 8mm camera that I borrowed, and we picked him up. We went to a local restaurant in town. We talked about it a little bit. I took some more notes, and we drove right up to the farm, and we started the interview in front of Kathleen's house. What I could not understand, Preston, is how did Colonel Levitt get up onto that farm? He said he had over 50 troops, 50 to 60 troops, and there was additional troops. They were up there with all of these army trucks, and I couldn't get it through my head. How did he get up there? The access road, you had to go through Kathleen Mays. You had to go up Depot Street to get by it. Well, came in through the logging road on the back end of the property because he lived up in that area, not far away. And Freddie May told me later on, after I interviewed the colonel, Levitt did not take me to the logging road. He was older. He didn't want to trek all the way up and go through all the damn woods up there. But Freddie took me up there. And the logging road led to a back street. And Levitt came up through the logging road. They parked all the army trucks in the back side of the property. And that's how they came up. When he had approximately 180 troops, and a contingent of them broke away, 50 to 60 of them stayed on the farm. And he told me they gathered soil samples, some of the oil on the farm where everything was, where the monster sat, the oil was leaking out. And the whole area had still stunk from the remnants of that gas because it went into the ground and it was still lingering there. And he gathered up everything, and he told his troops that he was going to break away. Remember I said earlier, the police were out running around Braxton County looking for an alleged airplane crash. It was actually a UFO crash. It was one that came into the area, and it crashed a few miles away near Frametown. And Colonel Levitt was up there with all his troops and boats, and they were going across the Elk River, going to the other side to where everybody saw this flaming object crash down into the mountain. And I said to him, I said, Colonel, I said, how long were you and your men up here on Flatwoods? He said, well, he was there for about 45 minutes and broke away with the contingent of the remaining troops. I said, well, how long did your guys stay up here? You ready for this? He said, they stayed the night. And I said, they stayed the night? He says, yeah, in case something else happened. He got orders from Washington to go up there to take samples. They cordoned the area off to unlawful entry. They didn't want anybody up there. And all the men took the samples. They stayed the night, and they left before sunup. The following morning, Ailey Stewart was up there. See how the story's connecting? The reporter went back. He was actually the first one that saw the Bailey Fisher farm at sunrise. And he went up and he almost fell over what he saw up there. The oil was splattered all through the tracks, and he was walking through the path. The oil was getting onto his clothing, and he said, and the sun was up, and that's when he looked down into the path. He said some of the small rocks were blown over. That's something you would never think of, where that thing hovered across the field. He said this thing was 4 foot wide. The propulsion of it knocked all the rocks and flipped them all over and turned them. And some of them were good sized stones. And he said, and that's when something caught my eye and something was gleaming the sun off of something. And he found the melted metal. It was about this big.
There's so much more to this incident. I feel like we're still getting just a piece of the picture, that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we'll probably never hear about.
Oh, absolutely. Well, he found this metal. He said it looked like drip solder, and he drew a picture of it for me. He said, and when he picked it up, it was thin. It was thin, but about that size.
All right.
And he said it looked like drip solder, like little octopus arms where it hit and it splattered out. Well, long story short, he had that metal in his possession and he took it to a local gas station. They put it in a vise and hit it with a gasoline blowtorch, and it wouldn't melt. It wouldn't melt. His father from the Democrat told him, he says, you're bragging how you found this damn piece of metal. You better keep your mouth shut. You don't know who's coming up here. In the meantime, the government was up there posing as magazine writers and newspaper reporters. And Miss Day actually had a run-in with them immediately that weekend. Then they came back, and they were men from Washington. Mrs. May poo-pooed them, told them to get the hell out of here. You're bothering me. She had like hundreds of people want to interview. They came back the next day and pulled her aside and said, we have to talk to you. We lied to you. We told you were magazine newspaper reporters from Clarksburg. And they said, we're from the United States government. And they wanted to talk to her. It was like no nonsense. She told me when she went up onto the farm, there was 2 of them. And these guys stood out. You're talking Central West Virginia, where the people are wearing jeans and T-shirts or whatever they're wearing, coveralls, kind of like what I wear. Up there, like newspaper reporters, magazine writers, and 3-piece $1,000 suits and alligator shoes. They stuck out. She was up there with Freddie on the farm. She said the 2 of them followed her up there. She said, I stood and talked to one, and the other guy broke away in the field, and he went up to the tree. He went up to the left. He was coming from the opposite direction where the monster came in. Right. And he disappeared into the woods for a few minutes. Now, Preston, this was kind of funny, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was in Kathleen's condo, and she had a big easy chair, like a Castro convertible. And she was kicked back and it telling me this story. And she started laughing hysterically. She says, well, Frank, she says, well, I was talking to that one guy there. The other one came back from behind the tree. He disappeared into the woods. And she says, when he came back, he looked like a zebra. And she's laughing. I says, what do you mean, Kathleen, a zebra? She said that beautiful $1,000 suit he had on was covered in oil. Where it had splattered and hit the trees. He was walking through it and it striped him. She said he looked like a striped zebra, every inch of him from head to toe. He had a hat on. It was ruined. And I'm going to ask you this and see if you pick up on this. She said the guy who was covered in oil walked up to the guy I was talking to and held his arms out. And Kathleen went like this and said, "Look at this. I wonder what Ed's going to think about this when we bring this in for analysis." Who was Ed in 1952? Do you know?
Ed?
And Edward Ruppelt, who was the head of Project Blue.
Wow.
Oh,
Okay.
And I cannot believe she remembered that from 1952. I wonder what Ed's going to think about this when we bring this in for analysis. I almost fell out of the chair. I was sitting over to the side of her, and I said, "Kathleen, I have a wild guess who Ed is." Well, in the meantime, I had got this, Preston. All of this is the Project Blue Book reports for this one night, about 90%. And
For
this
one-
is over a pound of paper. And I showed this to Mrs. May.
Wow.
I said, in 1952, Captain Edward Ruppelt was the head of Project Blue Book at ATIC at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And she says, "I always wondered who Ed was." And all she kept saying to me during our conversations as she started getting older, she said, "Frank, I pray that you get this book out before I die." I said, "Kathleen, mark my words, I'll get this damn book out before you die." She says, "And I want the first autographed copy of it."
Her life was changed forever from that night on, huh?
Yeah, it really was. And it was like I became part of her family because I was representing them. Those people would not talk to anybody else. They got sick of this whole story with the reporters botched everything up and they screwed everything up. They made this thing look like, this dumb thing. They made it look like this. And for all of those years, they thought it was a monster wearing a dress with arms and claws until I started working with the witnesses. Now, the biggest part of this whole story is I knew there had to be a beginning, a middle, and an end to this story. Flatwoods was just the end of it, Preston. I wanted to know where this thing came from. I started going through newspaper articles. Now, remember I said the Braxton County Monster story broke a couple days later, Sunday, and then when it hit the news wires that Monday, the 15th, okay? You know what all the articles were on September 13th, the day after, the 13th and 14th? All of these unknown objects, flying objects, flaming objects, meteors, planes crashing. This map behind me is the master map that I used right here. There's approximately 116 sightings that I used Project Blue Book. That map took decades to put together.
wow.
And what I figured out, I worked with Air Force, Army, Marine, retired guys. I live in Florida. I would go to military shows and I would talk to people. I work with air traffic controllers, pilots, you name it, guys who worked on F-94 Starfires, Sabre jets. I work with a guy who fought with Patton. I mean, you never know who you're going to meet down here in Florida. All of these old timers, they wear their military hats, but, I'm going back to the 90s. So a lot of those World War II vets and Korean War vets were alive, and they helped me with this project. I don't claim that I put this whole map together. I had a couple of guys helping me, and I had one guy stand in front and looked at it, and he went, "Oh my God, Frank, do you know what you have? We think like they do, or it's like vice versa." He said, "This is military." He said, "Do you know what you have here?" I says, "Not really." And at that point, I have a close-up I sent you. At that point, Preston, I had the timestamps, I had the trajectories, and I couldn't piece it together. And this one military guy from the Air Force stood there, and he almost hit the floor. He says, "Give me your drafting ruler and a pencil." and I handed it to him, and he's talking out loud. I'm not a military guy, and he just started marking. See all the flight paths?
Wow.
Okay, yeah.
Impressive.
He traced the flight paths, okay? All of those pinpointed areas, we worked in reverse. I had the farthest points forward. You see where it says ORNL there? That's Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I tracked the UFO in reverse, going all the way back, and it went 90 miles off the coast across from Washington. The second one went, if you drop down a little bit, yeah, that's where the first one was Oak Ridge. Now go above that area. Okay, keep going. You see what's directly? Keep going. You see what's directly? Keep going down. Okay, stop. You see where that red dot is? That's directly north of Oak Ridge. That's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Wow.
That's the base that they just slowed down. The second object, I traced it coming within a few miles of Wright-Patterson. And you see what it did? It turned around, went northeast, hit the northern panhandle of West Virginia, and went down to Charleston. The third object went over Washington, D.C. That's your flame over Washington, which was in all the different newspapers. It came in at treetop level over Washington, okay? When you intersect all three of those lines, see where they intersect off the East Coast? Yeah. 90 miles off the coast, 200 miles directly east of Washington, D.C. They all came in damaged over the eastern seaboard and made beelines. The first one flew down towards Wright-Patterson, towards Virginia. It went into Tennessee, and it crash landed across the border. Okay. The second one flew over Baltimore, went up, and it was gunning and making an exact beeline for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The third object came and passed over Washington, D.C. When it passed over Washington, D.C., without getting intercepted, which it should have, it flew right over the Capitol through the no-fly zone. When that flew over without being intercepted, the other two reversed their course and went in the opposite direction. Do you see that? Oh. They both went in the opposite direction. The third one that came in is your flame over Washington. There was thousands of sightings, Preston. Thousands of sightings. People saw these things for hours flying around the United States when they came in. And this had a good chunk of the information, except it was a pain in the neck. I spent 5 years going through this Project Blue Book documents. All the pages had to be re-inked because they were faded by the time they were copied into the Blue Book archives. But I was damned and determined I was going to figure this out. That night was actually, we were invaded. I started researching and working with Air Force guys. I kept saying, how did we shoot UFOs down in 52? Well, they had rocket-bearing craft back then. We had this guy here.
Oh, hold on.
There's your Sabre jet, and there's your F-94C Starfire. They had computers on board, and they were armed. Here's your Sabre jet. These had rockets on board.
Well, we're running out of time. I am so sad about it.
The nation's capital, Preston. They formed a perimeter. You always keep your best fighters around. And we recreated this whole scene within a couple minutes, which took years. And the three came over damaged over the eastern seaboard. I pinpointed every location where they landed and 13 locations where they crashed and went down, took off, or were puddle jumping across the United States. There was a service report that night, communication instructions for the for reporting of vital intelligence sightings. That's a tongue twister. And that's like red alert. We're in deep crap. And that service report was put out that night in a Flatwoods report. When that UFO, the second one, flew over Baltimore and it went up towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, when it redirected here, it went in the opposite direction towards the Wheeler, Ohio County Airport, nearly collided with a passenger plane, nearly clipped within a few feet and almost hit the wing of the plane and sent it down. All of this stuff was in hundreds of newspaper articles, except that all had to be put together and traced out on a map. And all the years my book has been out, Preston, nobody's been able to give me a better explanation than this. Because
Amazing.
enough of it was in Project Blue Book. Everything else I used. And I tied this into Shoot 'em Down because in July of 1952, a few days after the second flyovers in Washington, D.C., we had the back-to-back weekends. The Air Force came out and admitted Monsell Montz, who was the senior press spokesman for the Air Force, said that we have orders to shoot them down if we can't talk them down. And there were freestanding orders to shoot at flying saucers. That's what the Shoot 'em Down book is about.
Well, you know what? We're out of time. I'm so upset about it.
Already.
I really want to hear more.
Let's do it again.
Can you come back?
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Because I didn't even
get a lot more to talk about.
So thanks so much. I mean, everyone check out this book. We didn't even cover quite a bit of it. So amazing. The links are in the show notes, you guys, if you want to learn more about Frank Feschino and his research, and you can get this book. But thanks, Frank, so much for joining us tonight. Amazing. I mean, I am just speechless.
Thank you.
And I'm very educated. This has been a very enlightening experience. Heck, I'll tune into the next one.
And you know what? Well, you know what the government said all of this was? They blamed all of these sightings on a meteor that was seen for 5 to 6 seconds.
Wow.
The whole sequence of hours was blamed on one meteor, a fireball meteor. And they said the Flatwoods monster was more than likely probably an owl in a tree. So if anybody else out there has a better explanation or could explain this map behind me, please contact me or Preston.
Wow. Yeah, thanks, Frank. That was amazing.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I can't wait to have you back because this, wow. All right. Thank you guys for joining us on the Lightgate episode 86. I want to thank you, Namaste, all the people in chat, Owlman. Really appreciate your generous donations. Cliff Olinger, Christine, in my opinion, Don Curtis, all you guys in chat were amazing. I'm so sorry I didn't get to the questions, but honestly, you had me gripped. You absolutely had me riveted to my seat listening to this amazing account. So yeah, we'll definitely contact you to bring you back on. Truly, truly appreciate you coming tonight. You, Michelle, thank you so much for also standing in for Dolly. I know she's chomping at the bit.
I know she is. I know she is.
You better get better for the next show.
She will. She won't miss it. All right. Well, I guess we are officially signing off. So thank you to everybody who's just basically tuned into the Lightgate tonight. We did broadcast on the United Public Radio Network UFO Paranormal Radio Network 105.3 from the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM from beautiful New Orleans, fully sponsored by Coronation, and we thank him for being the newest part of the Lightgate journey. So please remember to tune in next week because I believe Dolly and Preston are having an open mic, and that will be the night to talk about everything that's going on as per following the chat room. We know where you're
We'll
going.
talk
and
about the drones, I promise.
there we go. There we go. So, guys, thank you very much. Have a great week, I guess. I guess
Right.
it's going to be me next time, next Wednesday. So, thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.